Commander Jake Mitchell had attended exactly 9 formal diplomatic receptions in his military career, and not once had any of them involved watching alien royalty systematically humiliate visiting dignitaries for entertainment while crowds of nobles cheered. Like this was the highlight of the galactic social calendar. Queen Valdris of the Altarian Dominion held court in a throne room designed to make visiting species feel small and insignificant, with soaring crystal formations that amplified sound and light in ways that turned every word into a performance and every gesture into a statement of absolute authority. "Humans," Queen Valdris announced, her voice carrying across the vast space with the kind of projection that suggested she'd spent years perfecting the art of making people feel diminished by her mere presence, "are such fascinating creatures. So small, so short-lived, so optimistic about their relevance to galactic politics." Jake stood with the Terran diplomatic delegation, maintaining the professional composure that had gotten him through 6 years of military operations involving hostile governments and unstable political situations. Beside him, Ambassador Sarah Chin shifted nervously as Queen Valdris's attention focused on their group with predatory interest. The Queen herself was an imposing figure, nearly 8 feet tall with the characteristic pale golden skin of her species and ears that swept back in elegant points that somehow managed to suggest both beauty and arrogance. Her ceremonial robes were designed to emphasize her height advantage while the crystalline crown that marked her royal status caught and refracted light in patterns that made her seem to glow with inner fire. "Ambassador Chen," Queen Valdris said, her tone carrying the kind of false courtesy that preceded public humiliation, "your delegation includes military personnel." "How quaint. Do humans believe that bringing soldiers to diplomatic negotiations demonstrates strength?" "Your Majesty," Sarah replied with careful diplomatic neutrality, "Commander Mitchell serves as military liaison for matters requiring technical expertise regarding defense cooperation." "Defense cooperation," Queen Valdris repeated, her laughter echoing through the throne room like breaking glass. "Between the Altarian Dominion and Terra. How wonderfully ambitious of your species to imagine you have anything to offer that we might find valuable." Jake maintained his position and his silence, studying Queen Valdris with the analytical attention he developed during his years of psychological operations training. Something about her performance felt rehearsed, calculated to provoke specific responses from visiting diplomats. "Commander Mitchell," Queen Valdris said, her attention shifting to him with sharp focus, "you've been remarkably quiet during these negotiations. Do human warriors lack the courage to speak in the presence of superior authority?" "Your Majesty," Jake replied evenly, "I've been observing." "Observing what, exactly?" "Your technique," Jake said simply. Queen Valdris's expression shifted slightly, curiosity mixing with the imperious confidence that seemed to be her default emotional setting. "My technique?" "Your performance," Jake clarified, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the dangerous territory he was entering. "It's quite impressive, from a tactical perspective." The throne room fell silent as nobles and diplomatic personnel processed the fact that the human military officer had just suggested that their queen's behavior was some kind of calculated display rather than natural authority. "Performance?" Queen Valdris's voice carried new undertones that suggested Jake had touched on something sensitive. "Commander Mitchell, are you suggesting that royal authority is somehow artificial?" "I'm suggesting," Jake said, stepping forward slightly while maintaining respectful distance, "that anyone who needs to constantly prove their superiority probably has some doubts about whether they actually possess it." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Queen Valdris stared at him with an expression that cycled through surprise, fury, and something that might have been curiosity about where this unprecedented challenge was leading. "How dare you," Queen Valdris said, rising from her throne with fluid grace that emphasized her impressive height, "question my authority in my own court." "Your Majesty," Jake replied calmly, "I'm not questioning your authority. I'm questioning why you feel the need to prove it through humiliation rather than demonstration." Queen Valdris moved closer, her golden skin shifting to deeper tones that suggested either anger or some other intense emotion that Jake couldn't interpret. "You insignificant little creature," she said, her voice carrying enough venom to dissolve whole plating, "do you truly believe that your primitive species' opinions matter to someone of my stature?" Jake studied her face as she delivered this insult, noting the way her eyes searched his expression for signs of the intimidation or rage that her provocations were clearly designed to produce. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask. I reserve the right to have you executed for impertinence. When was the last time someone told you that you were wrong about something important?" The question caught Queen Valdris off guard, her aggressive posture faltering slightly as she processed what he'd asked. "I am never wrong about important matters," she replied, but her tone carried less certainty than her words suggested. "Everyone is wrong sometimes," Jake said gently. "The difference is whether you're surrounded by people who care enough about you to help you recognize mistakes, or people who are too afraid to risk your displeasure by telling you uncomfortable truths." Queen Valdris's expression underwent a subtle transformation, her imperious mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "And which category do you place yourself in, Commander Mitchell?" Jake looked around the throne room at the assembled nobles who were watching this exchange with obvious fascination and nervous energy, then back at Queen Valdris whose golden eyes were studying his face with intensity that suggested this conversation had become more important than either of them had anticipated. "Your Majesty," he said, moving close enough that his next words would be audible only to her, "I place myself in the category of someone who recognizes that the loneliest person in any room is usually the one everyone's afraid to contradict." Queen Valdris's mocking laughter died instantly, her breath catching as Jake's words hit something deeper than her carefully constructed public persona. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice carrying none of the commanding authority she'd displayed moments earlier. Jake met her eyes directly, speaking with the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of diffusing hostile situations through understanding rather than force. "I said that you're not cruel because you're strong," he said softly. "You're cruel because you're terrified. And the saddest part is that everyone's so afraid of your anger that no one's ever bothered to find out what you're actually afraid of." Queen Valdris stared at him with an expression that mixed shock with something that looked remarkably like relief, as if someone had finally spoken words she'd been waiting her entire reign to hear. The throne room remained silent as every being present sensed that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The moment when someone looked past Queen Valdris's fearsome reputation to see the person she'd been hiding beneath it. "No one," Queen Valdris said barely above a whisper, "has ever spoken to me like that before." "Maybe," Jake replied gently, "it was time someone did." The private audience Queen Valdris requested took place in her personal chambers 3 hours after Jake's whispered revelation had transformed the most feared monarch in 3-star systems into someone who looked remarkably like a confused young woman trying to process an entirely new way of understanding herself. "Commander Mitchell," she said, settling into a chair that managed to look both regal and somehow less intimidating than her massive throne, "I need you to explain what you think you accomplished with your analysis of my character." Jake studied the private chambers, noting how different Queen Valdris seemed when separated from the performance space of her throne room. Her golden skin had returned to normal tones, her posture was less rigidly perfect, and her voice carried musical undertones that suggested genuine curiosity rather than imperial command. "Your Majesty," Jake said, taking the seat she'd indicated while maintaining respectful distance, "I didn't accomplish anything. I simply recognized something that seemed important." "And what did you recognize?" Jake considered how to explain psychological operations training to someone who'd probably never encountered the concept that behavior could be analyzed and understood rather than simply accepted or feared. "Your Majesty, in human military training, we study what we call defensive aggression, behavior patterns where people use hostility to prevent others from getting close enough to discover vulnerabilities." Queen Valdris's ears tilted forward with sharp attention. "You're suggesting that my authority is defensive?" "I'm suggesting that your cruelty serves a purpose beyond simply demonstrating power," Jake replied carefully. "It creates distance between you and people who might otherwise expect emotional connection or genuine relationship." "And why would I want to prevent emotional connection?" Jake looked at Queen Valdris's face, noting how her question carried genuine puzzlement rather than rhetorical challenge. "Because emotional connection requires trust. And trust requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous when you've been taught that showing weakness leads to destruction." Queen Valdris was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes focusing on something beyond the confines of her chambers. "Commander Mitchell, what do you know about Altarian succession protocols? I know that your species values strength above other leadership qualities, and that perceived weakness can trigger challenges to royal authority. I inherited this throne when I was 14 years old," Queen Valdris said, her voice carrying new harmonics that suggested she was sharing something she'd never spoken aloud before. "My parents died in what was officially called an accident, but was actually assassination by noble families who viewed their diplomatic approach to governance as unacceptable weakness." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand the personal history that had shaped Queen Valdris's leadership style. "So you learned that survival required demonstrating strength." "I learned that survival required ensuring no one ever saw me as anything other than an absolute authority who would destroy anyone foolish enough to challenge my power." Queen Valdris's hands moved restlessly across the arms of her chair. "For 23 years, that strategy has been completely effective." "At what cost?" The question seemed to surprise Queen Valdris, her expression shifting to something more vulnerable than Jake had yet seen from her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jake said gently, "that strategies designed for survival don't always serve long-term flourishing." "What has 23 years of defensive aggression cost you personally?" Queen Valdris studied him with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was processing an entirely new framework for understanding her own behavior. "I don't have personal relationships," she said finally. "I have political alliances, military subordinates, and court functionaries. But I don't have friends. People who value my company rather than my authority. Do you want those kinds of relationships?" "I don't know," Queen Valdris admitted. "I've never allowed myself to consider the possibility that they might be available to someone in my position." Before Jake could respond to that revelation, the chamber doors chimed with an incoming request for audience. Queen Valdris composed herself with visible effort, returning to the imperial bearing that had carried her through decades of political survival. "Enter," she called, switching back to the commanding tones that Jake was beginning to recognize as her professional voice. Ambassador Sarah Chen entered with the expression of someone who had spent 3 hours fielding increasingly concerned communications from multiple diplomatic sources while trying to figure out what her military liaison had said to render an alien queen speechless. "Your Majesty, Commander Mitchell," Sarah said, her tone carrying carefully controlled urgency, "we've received several inquiries from Lord Commander Thex regarding this private consultation. He seems concerned about potential security implications." Queen Valdris exchanged a meaningful look with Jake, and both of them understood that their psychological conversation was now a matter of political interest to the Altarian military establishment. "Ambassador Chen," Queen Valdris said carefully, "Lord Commander Thex takes his responsibilities regarding royal security very seriously. Perhaps overly seriously. Is there something I should know about Commander Mitchell's diplomatic approach that might affect our mission?" Sarah asked, clearly trying to navigate between supporting her colleague and preventing an interstellar incident. Jake looked at Queen Valdris, who gave an almost imperceptible nod that suggested permission to explain the situation in terms that wouldn't immediately trigger political crisis. "Sarah," Jake said, "it appears that my analysis of Altarian leadership psychology has personal relevance for Her Majesty. The behavioral patterns I identified aren't just theoretical, they're practical concerns that affect how the Altarian court functions." Sarah processed this information with the expression of someone realizing that military psychological training had accidentally wandered into active therapy territory. "Jake, are you telling me you've been psychoanalyzing an alien queen?" "I'm telling you," Queen Valdris said, rising from her chair with something that looked like newfound confidence, "that Commander Mitchell has demonstrated insight into leadership challenges that I had not previously considered." "What kind of challenges?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The kind where effective survival strategies become counterproductive when circumstances change," Jake replied. "The kind where behaviors that protect you in one context can isolate you in another." Queen Valdris moved closer to the window that overlooked her capital city, her expression showing something that looked remarkably like hope mixed with uncertainty. "Ambassador Chen," she said, Commander Mitchell has suggested that there might be alternatives to ruling through intimidation. That authority based on respect rather than fear might be possible. And what does Lord Commander Thex think about these alternative approaches? Sarah asked carefully. Queen Valdris's smile was sharp enough to cut through diplomatic protocol. Lord Commander Thex believes that any deviation from traditional Altarian power structures represents dangerous weakness that could trigger political instability. Does he have reason to be concerned? Jake asked. He has reason to be invested in maintaining systems that have served his interests for decades, Queen Valdris replied. Whether those same systems serve the broader welfare of my people is a question he's never been required to consider. As Jake listened to Queen Valdris discuss the politics of personal transformation, he realized that his psychological analysis had accidentally triggered something much more significant than individual insight. He had started a revolution in how an entire species thought about power, authority, and the relationship between strength and vulnerability. The confrontation Jake had been anticipating arrived at dawn the next day, delivered by Lord Commander Thex with the kind of military precision that suggested he'd been planning this challenge since the moment Queen Valdris began questioning traditional Altarian power structures. Commander Mitchell, Thex announced, entering the diplomatic quarters with an escort of Altarian guards who managed to look both respectful and threatening. I require immediate clarification regarding your influence over Her Majesty's recent, philosophical developments. Jake looked up from his analysis of Altarian political structures, where he'd been trying to understand how Queen Valdris might implement leadership changes without triggering the kind of succession crisis that had cost her parents their lives. Lord Commander Thex, Jake replied, maintaining the professional courtesy that diplomatic protocol required, my conversations with Queen Valdris have been limited to cultural exchange and comparative analysis of leadership methodologies. Cultural exchange that has apparently convinced our Queen to question centuries of successful governance traditions, Thex said, his golden skin shifting to deeper tones that suggested barely controlled anger. Commander Mitchell, do you understand what you have done? I've provided perspective on alternative approaches to authority and social leadership, Jake said carefully. Nothing more than that. You have undermined the psychological foundations that maintain Altarian political stability, Thex replied, moving closer with the predatory grace that marked his species' military elite. You have convinced our Queen that weakness can be disguised as strength. Before Jake could respond to that accusation, the quarter's communication system activated with Queen Valdris's voice carrying new harmonics that suggested she was speaking with unprecedented authority. Lord Commander Thex, you will report to the throne room immediately for consultation regarding military protocol updates. The silence that followed was charged with political tension as Thex processed the fact that Queen Valdris was summoning him rather than permitting him to conduct his interrogation of the human military officer. Your Majesty, Thex replied through the communication system, I am currently conducting security assessment of potential foreign influence operations. You are currently questioning my judgment regarding diplomatic consultation, Queen Valdris corrected, her voice carrying steel underneath the musical tones. Report to the throne room, Lord Commander. Now. Jake watched Thex struggle between his desire to continue challenging what he saw as dangerous foreign influence and his obligation to obey direct royal commands. This conversation is not concluded, Commander Mitchell, Thex said finally, though his tone suggested he was less confident about his authority than he'd been when he arrived. 20 minutes later, Jake found himself in the throne room alongside Ambassador Sarah and a collection of Altarian nobles who had apparently been summoned to witness whatever announcement Queen Valdris was preparing to make. Queen Valdris entered with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she'd spent the morning making decisions that would reshape everything about how the Altarian Dominion understood itself. Lord Commander Thex, she said, taking her position on the throne while maintaining the regal bearing that had carried her through decades of political survival, you expressed concern about foreign influence on royal decision-making processes. Your Majesty, Thex replied, executing a precise military salute that somehow managed to convey respect while maintaining an undercurrent of challenge. I expressed concern about the psychological manipulation of Altarian leadership by external agents with questionable motives. Queen Valdris's laugh was like crystal bells being struck by hammers, musical and slightly dangerous. Lord Commander, are you suggesting that I am incapable of distinguishing between manipulation and genuine insight? I am suggesting, Your Majesty, that foreign psychological operations specialists are trained to exploit emotional vulnerabilities for strategic advantage. Jake felt every eye in the throne room focus on him as the assembled Altarian nobility realized that Lord Commander Thex was publicly questioning their queen's competence while simultaneously accusing the human military officer of conducting espionage operations. Lord Commander, Queen Valdris said, her voice carrying undertones that Jake's training recognized as barely controlled fury, Commander Mitchell has provided cultural analysis that has helped me understand the difference between ruling through fear and ruling through respect. Fear ensures loyalty, Your Majesty. Respect is unreliable and subject to change based on political convenience. Is it? Queen Valdris asked, rising from her throne with fluid grace. Lord Commander, how long have you served as my chief military advisor? 15 years, Your Majesty. And in those 15 years, have you ever offered counsel that contradicted my preferences or challenged my assumptions? Thex was quiet for a moment, clearly recognizing that he was being led into territory that might prove dangerous to his political position. Your Majesty, my counsel has always been designed to serve your interests and maintain the stability of your reign. That's not what I asked, Queen Valdris said, stepping down from the throne platform to move closer to Thex. I asked whether you've ever told me I was wrong about something important. Your Majesty rarely makes errors in judgment significant enough to require correction. Queen Valdris turned toward Jake, her expression showing something that looked remarkably like vindication mixed with sadness. Commander Mitchell, she said, Lord Commander Thex has just demonstrated the precise problem you identified. He is so concerned with maintaining my approval that he cannot provide honest counsel when honest counsel might be unwelcome. Jake felt the weight of political history settling on his shoulders as he realized that Queen Valdris was using their conversation about defensive leadership to challenge her entire governmental structure. Your Majesty, he said carefully, effective leadership requires advisors who prioritize truth over comfort. But implementing that kind of change requires careful consideration of existing power dynamics. Are you suggesting that I cannot handle the political consequences of demanding honesty from my subordinates? Queen Valdris asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than offense. I'm suggesting that systemic change requires strategic planning to avoid destabilizing the very institutions you're trying to improve. Lord Commander Thex stepped forward with obvious determination. Your Majesty, this conversation demonstrates exactly why foreign influence represents a threat to Altarian political stability. Commander Mitchell is encouraging you to question fundamental principles that have maintained order for centuries. Lord Commander, Queen Valdris said, her voice gaining the kind of authority that Jake suspected had made her an effective ruler despite her defensive strategies. Commander Mitchell is encouraging me to consider whether those fundamental principles serve my people's welfare or simply my personal security. Your personal security is essential to political stability. My personal growth is essential to effective leadership, Queen Valdris corrected. And growth requires the courage to acknowledge when existing approaches have become counterproductive. The throne room fell silent as the assembled nobles processed the fact that their queen was publicly rejecting the leadership philosophy that had defined Altarian governance for generations. Your Majesty, said Cultural Advisor Vex, stepping forward with obvious nervousness, are you suggesting fundamental changes to how the Dominion operates? I'm suggesting, Queen Valdris replied, that we evaluate whether our current systems actually serve the goals they're supposed to achieve. She looked around the throne room at advisors and nobles who were clearly struggling to process the implications of what she was proposing. For 23 years, I have ruled through intimidation because I was taught that fear ensures loyalty. But Commander Mitchell has helped me understand that fear ensures compliance, not loyalty. And compliance without genuine commitment creates brittleness rather than strength. Your Majesty, Lord Commander Thex said, his voice carrying new edge, if you abandon traditional authority structures, you invite challenge from those who would exploit perceived weakness. Queen Valdris's smile was radiant enough to power the palace's lighting systems. Lord Commander, if my authority cannot survive honest evaluation, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive. As Jake watched Queen Valdris defend her right to evolve beyond the limitations of her upbringing, he realized that his psychological analysis had triggered something unprecedented in galactic politics. They were witnessing the moment when a monarch chose growth over safety, truth over comfort, and the possibility of genuine respect over the certainty of fearful obedience. The formal challenge to Queen Valdris's authority came exactly as Jake had predicted it would, during the next Royal Council session, when Lord Commander Thex would have maximum political support and maximum public visibility for what amounted to an attempted coup disguised as concern for governmental stability. Your Majesty, Thex announced to the assembled council of nobles, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives, I formally request evaluation of your fitness to continue ruling the Altarian Dominion. The council chamber erupted in shocked discussion as beings from across the political spectrum processed the fact that the Queen's chief military advisor was publicly questioning her competence to govern. Queen Valdris remained seated on her throne, her expression showing neither surprise nor anger, but rather the kind of calm determination that suggested she had been preparing for this confrontation since the moment she decided to choose growth over safety. Lord Commander Thex, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with perfect clarity, please state your specific concerns regarding my leadership capabilities. Your Majesty, your recent interactions with foreign psychological operations specialists have resulted in fundamental changes to your decision-making processes that threaten the stability of traditional Altarian governance. Thex activated holographic displays that filled the chamber with what appeared to be comprehensive analysis of Queen Valdris's recent policy considerations, behavioral modifications, and philosophical developments. These changes, Thex continued, represent abandonment of proven leadership methodologies in favor of experimental approaches that prioritize alien cultural values over Altarian political necessities. Jake watched this presentation with the analytical attention he developed during his years of studying hostile propaganda, noting how Thex was framing Queen Valdris's personal growth as foreign contamination rather than natural evolution. Lord Commander, Queen Valdris said calmly, are you suggesting that learning from other cultures represents disloyalty to Altarian interests? I am suggesting that fundamental changes to royal psychology based on alien influence represent potential security threats that require careful evaluation. And who would conduct this evaluation? The traditional council of military and noble advisors who have maintained Altarian stability for centuries. Queen Valdris rose from her throne with fluid grace, her impressive height making her a commanding presence even when surrounded by beings who were questioning her authority. The same advisors, she said, who have spent decades ensuring that I never receive honest counsel that might challenge my assumptions or encourage personal growth. She moved to the center of the council chamber where every representative could see her clearly. Lord Commander Thex speaks of traditional methodologies and proven leadership approaches, Queen Valdris announced. But I ask you to consider what those methodologies have actually achieved. She activated her own holographic displays, showing political, economic, and social data that painted a comprehensive picture of Altarian society under her reign. 23 years of ruling through intimidation has created a population that complies with royal directives but shows no genuine loyalty to royal leadership. A military that follows orders but demonstrates no creative initiative when facing unexpected challenges. A nobility that supports the throne out of fear rather than conviction. The council chamber fell silent as representatives processed data that suggested Queen Valdris's traditional leadership approach had been less effective than they'd assumed. Furthermore, Queen Valdris continued, our approach to interspecies relations has isolated the Altarian Dominion from potential allies who might enhance our political and economic strength. Your Majesty, said noble advisor Kess, are you suggesting that our isolation is a weakness rather than a strength? I'm suggesting that isolation based on superiority complexes prevents us from learning from species who might have valuable knowledge to share. Jake felt the chamber's attention shift toward him as Queen Valdris's argument began to focus on the benefits of cross-cultural exchange rather than the dangers of foreign influence. Commander Mitchell, Queen Valdris said, would you please explain to the Council what human military doctrine teaches about the relationship between adaptability and strength? Jake stood, aware that his next words would either support Queen Valdris's transformation or provide ammunition for Lord Commander Thex's challenge to her authority. Honored representatives, he said, drawing on his diplomatic training to address beings who held the power to either accept or reject everything Queen Valdris was proposing. Human military strategy emphasizes that strength comes from the ability to learn, adapt, and integrate new approaches with existing capabilities. He activated his own data displays, showing comparative analysis of military effectiveness, political stability, and economic prosperity across species that embraced versus rejected cultural exchange. Species that remain isolated from external influence tend to stagnate, becoming vulnerable to challenges they haven't anticipated. Species that thoughtfully integrate beneficial external knowledge tend to become stronger, more resilient, and more capable of responding effectively to changing circumstances. And what about species that allow external influence to corrupt their core values? Lord Commander Thex challenged. External influence becomes corruption when it's imposed rather than chosen, Jake replied. But when leaders consciously evaluate external knowledge and integrate beneficial elements while maintaining their essential cultural identity, the result is evolution rather than contamination. Queen Valdris stepped forward, her expression showing something that looked remarkably like pride mixed with determination. The council must decide, she announced, whether the Altarian Dominion will continue to prioritize the illusion of strength through isolation, or embrace the reality of strength through conscious growth. Your Majesty, Lord Commander Thex said, this choice represents fundamental transformation of everything that has made Altarian civilization successful. Yes, Queen Valdris agreed, it does. She looked around the council chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives who were clearly struggling to process the implications of what she was proposing. I am asking you to trust that your queen can grow beyond the limitations of her upbringing without abandoning the responsibilities of her position. I am asking you to believe that authentic strength is more valuable than performed strength. And I am asking you to support leadership that earns respect through competence rather than demanding obedience through fear. The vote that followed was closer than Jake had expected but more decisive than he had dared hope. When Cultural Advisor Vex announced the final result, confidence in Queen Valdris's continued leadership by a margin of 42 to 31, Jake realized that an alien species had just chosen evolution over tradition. Lord Commander Thex, Queen Valdris said, her voice carrying new harmonics that suggested she was speaking with authority earned rather than inherited, you have served the Altarian Dominion with dedication and honor. But your approach to leadership consultation has become counterproductive to effective governance. Your Majesty, Thex said carefully, are you removing me from my position? I am offering you the opportunity to evolve your advisory methodology to emphasize honest counsel over protective compliance, Queen Valdris replied. Your military expertise remains valuable, but your approach to providing that expertise requires adaptation. Lord Commander Thex was quiet for a moment, processing both his political defeat and the unexpected offer of continued service under modified conditions. Your Majesty, he said finally, what would this evolved advisory methodology involve? It would involve telling me when I'm wrong, even when that might displease me, Queen Valdris said with something that looked remarkably like a smile. It would involve prioritizing the welfare of our people over the comfort of our traditions. And it would involve recognizing that strength comes from the ability to change when change serves beneficial purposes. She turned to address the entire council, her expression showing the kind of confident authority that Jake suspected represented her authentic leadership style rather than the defensive performance she'd maintained for decades. The Altarian Dominion will implement gradual reforms designed to enhance governmental effectiveness while preserving cultural identity, Queen Valdris announced. We will establish cultural exchange programs with species who demonstrate beneficial knowledge. We will modify military doctrine to emphasize protection rather than conquest. And we will restructure advisory protocols to encourage honest counsel rather than fearful compliance. The applause that followed was genuinely enthusiastic rather than merely obligatory, coming from beings who recognized that they had witnessed something unprecedented in Altarian political history. Commander Mitchell, Queen Valdris said, I formally request that you serve as Chief Advisor on Human-Altarian Relations, with particular emphasis on helping us understand how strength through adaptability can be implemented within traditional governmental frameworks. Jake felt reality shift around him as he realized that his psychological analysis of an arrogant alien queen had somehow evolved into a diplomatic appointment that would reshape interspecies relations for generations. "Your Majesty," he said, "I'm honored by your confidence. But I should point out that implementing systemic change requires careful planning to avoid unintended consequences. Which is exactly why I need an advisor who understands both the benefits and the risks of transformation," Queen Valdris replied. "Someone who can help me grow without losing everything that makes me effective as a leader." Ambassador Sarah stepped forward with obvious pride mixed with amazement. "Your Majesty, the Terran Federation would be honored to support these cultural exchange initiatives." Ambassador Chen, Queen Valdris said, "I believe our species have much to learn from each other. But the most important lesson I've learned from Commander Mitchell is that learning requires the humility to acknowledge that we don't already know everything we need to know." As the council session concluded and representatives began discussing the practical implementation of Queen Valdris's reforms, Jake found himself alone with the alien queen who had somehow transformed from galactic tyrant to reform-minded leader in the span of a single conversation. "Your Majesty," he said, "are you certain about this path? Fundamental change carries significant risks, especially for someone in your position." Queen Valdris's smile was radiant enough to power interstellar navigation. "Jake, may I call you Jake?" "Of course, Your Majesty." "Valdris," she corrected. "When we're discussing personal matters rather than political ones, just Valdris." She moved closer, her golden eyes showing emotions that suggested this conversation had become as much about personal connection as professional cooperation. "Jake, you asked me when someone had last told me I was wrong about something important. The answer was never. But more importantly, no one had ever cared enough about my welfare to risk my displeasure by helping me become better than I was. And now I understand that the strongest relationships aren't built between people who never challenge each other, but between people who challenge each other to grow," Valdris said, taking his hand with the same courage she'd shown in challenging her entire governmental system. "That sounds like wisdom that extends beyond political leadership," Jake observed. "Yes," Valdris agreed, her voice carrying harmonics that made her meaning unmistakably clear. "It does." 6 months later, their partnership ceremony was held in the same throne room where Jake had first challenged Queen Valdris's defensive cruelty, combining Altarian bonding traditions with human commitment ceremonies. The event was attended by representatives from dozens of species who wanted to witness the union that had redefined their understanding of strength, leadership, and the possibility of finding love through the courage to see past defensive barriers to the person hiding underneath. Valdris wore ceremonial robes that incorporated both traditional Altarian authority symbols and new designs that emphasized cooperation rather than domination, while Jake discovered that formal alien partnership attire was surprisingly comfortable when tailored by someone who understood both dignity and practicality. And in the diplomatic archives of every species present, their story became required study for anyone involved in psychological operations or cross-cultural negotiations, proof that sometimes the most powerful victories are achieved not by defeating your opponents, but by helping them become the best version of themselves. The galaxy, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to prove that authentic strength lay not in never showing vulnerability, but in having the courage to acknowledge weaknesses and grow beyond them with the support of people who cared enough to speak uncomfortable truths with love rather than judgment. Jake never did finish all those psychological warfare manuals his training had recommended. As it turned out, the most important battles were fought not with weapons designed to destroy, but with words that healed, honesty that liberated, and the revolutionary concept that even the most defensive people could learn to trust when someone approached them with genuine concern rather than strategic manipulation. They made an excellent team, proving that sometimes the most transformative relationships begin when someone is brave enough to see past the armor we wear to protect ourselves and speak directly to the person we're hiding underneath.